Welcome to the Sirius Report. This, of course, is Paul from the Sirius Report, and I'm returning today to discuss further developments associated with Ukraine. There is no doubt in the years to come, when the war finally ends, there'll be revelations coming out about developments that happened prior to the war and during the war. Some will be more obvious than others. And I wanted to start today in that vein, talking about developments associated with the United States, where there are now claims that Tony Blinken, who was the US Secretary of State, no longer, urged Ukraine to continue military efforts against Russia rather than pursue peace negotiations. And this was back in 2022, so the back end of 2022. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, at that time advised Kiev to capitalise, they said, on its successes on the battlefield by seeking peace talks with Russia. It is claimed Blinken insisted that Ukraine should carry on with its military campaign. Now, this sort of ties in with all the statements that came out regarding peace negotiations in early 2022 with regards to Istanbul, where both sides, of course, agreed to a truce whereby Kiev would renounce its NATO membership, adopt neutrality, and limit its military size in exchange for international security guarantees. Of course, that all came to an abrupt end, apparently due to the visit of Boris Johnson, who was then the UK Prime Minister. What's also worth recalling is that the Biden administration admitted to covertly arm Ukraine months before the conflict started. This was in September and December of 2021. They provided them a whole load of weapons to make sure they had them in hand. What, of course, they would need to defend themselves. So that was Stingers and Javelins as two obvious examples. So, again, this idea that Russia was not provoked, this idea that everything was done to try and end the war and not allow it to drag on, it was absolutely clearly obvious. Elements in the United States wanted to provoke this war. They wanted the war to carry on such that in the end, Russia, they thought, would lose, that Russia would suffer huge economic financial damage. And of course, in the process, the ruble would capitulate, Putin would be gone. And really, it would be a hammer blow to multipolarity. And in the end, of course, the prizes from their perspective was always to try and balkanize Russia and eventually steal all Russia's enormous resources. Of course, none of this was going to happen because Russia's a nuclear power. And as they said, if there was, from their perspective, an existential threat of such gravity, they would have resorted to using nuclear weapons. Something perhaps people in the Biden administration didn't take seriously, but they should take seriously. But I'm sure, as I said, in the coming years, we will hear more and more revelations about developments that went on from the Western side, from the Russian side, and of course the Ukrainian side. But then we come on to the issue of Trump, who part of his election promise was that I will end the Ukraine war in 24 hours. Well, that clearly was never going to happen. It was never going to happen when he said it, and certainly, of course, more than 24 hours have gone by and it hasn't happened. One thing we do know is the Trump administration is not invited any Ukrainian legislators to Washington to discuss with them the progress of the war and have any dialogue with them. And it's not expected he wants to do so in any way, shape or form. This tells you very clearly that communications between Zelensky's office and Trump's team are fraught, and that's putting it politely. Apparently, Zelensky was outraged that he didn't travel to Trump's inauguration, clearly wasn't invited. And I don't think, to be honest, and we've said this previously, Trump has an awful lot of time for Zelensky in any way, shape or form. However, Trump's attitude towards Russia is going to prove to be a big mistake if he carries on behaving the way he is, because he's already come out and made statements that he could impose new tariffs and sanctions on Russia's export if the conflict in Ukraine isn't resolved in the near future. He says, if we don't make a deal, and soon, I will have no other choice but to put high levels of taxes, tariffs, and sanctions on anything being sold by Russia to the United States. Some reference to other participating countries, not clear what that meant. But we all know Russia basically exports next to nothing to the United States except uranium, which the United States needs, or enriched uranium. So that's a huge problem because Russia will just stop exporting it. And the other thing is that the United States needs Russian heavy oil, which is used, for example, in diesel and jet fuel and bunker fuel. So good luck to the United States if it doesn't have those products available because of the idea of sanctioning what Russia sells to the United States. Note, he doesn't say anything about trying to put additional sanctions on Russia on a global basis and trying to enforce it with the world, because he knows that won't succeed. And rather foolishly, Trump also came out and said, I'm going to do a very big favour to the Russian side, settle now and stop the ridiculous war, because it's only going to get worse. And the obvious question is, worse for who? Because it's only getting worse for the Ukraine on a daily, weekly, monthly basis in any way, shape or form. Not for Russia. Russia's taking more and more territory and also inflicting enormous losses on the Ukrainian side that they simply cannot afford to happen. As we always said, all death is totally unacceptable. Doesn't matter who dies, all war is reprehensible. But this war carrying on is just killing a lot of Ukrainians for no reason whatsoever, except to try and satisfy the political desires of people in the West who cannot afford for Russia to win the war because their political careers will be in tatters. So Trump, trying to sound tough, goes, we can do it the easy way or the hard way. The easy way is always better. It's time to make a deal. But Trump doesn't realise Russia does not have to make a deal with Donald Trump. They don't care what Trump says, publicly or privately. They've made their position very, very clear. That the war has to end based on the conditions that was agreed at Istanbul, plus the current situation we find in, and of course Russia now controlling Donbass, Zaporozhye, and of course Kherson. Anything else is irrelevant, and Trump can sit there and thinks he can hardball the Russian, not realising they've spent 3 years dealing with sanctions and have not had a problem with it. In fact, Russia's economy has grown from strength to strength, and it is easily able to outproduce the West in totality, or NATO country, in terms of military armaments. I think another thing that, with regards to the Russian perspective on this, is just because Trump has come into office, they don't believe in any way, shape or form that he's going to do anything that would remotely damage at least the United States perspective on global hegemony. I mean, and, therefore he's not going to do anything that would remotely make the United States look weak. So he's going to try and feel as though he can come in and say, well, this is how the war's going to end. You're going to accept the terms, or I'm going to make life difficult for you. And of course, one of those is that Trump wants the idea of freezing the conflict, but Russia's not going to agree to that. They're going to have to resolve these issues, not in terms of freezing the conflict, but ending it in totality. And he thinks he can put pressure on Russia. So you'll have to sit down at the negotiating table and agree to this scenario of freezing the crisis or the war, because then he can say, I ended the war. I did end it in a few days, and then the negotiating position could go on for weeks, months, and end up in total failure. Russia's not going to do that. It's not a question of the war ending before a agreed negotiated settlement is in place. I think the other feeling coming out of Russia is that Trump's grasp of the war and the way of resolving the Ukrainian conflict is not very good, which they find concerning, and clearly and rightly so, because it's causing him to have ideas as to how the war should end, which are wholly incompatible with the reality on the ground. I think the idea that there's going to now be any changes to the US approach with regards to sanctions against Russia is extremely unlikely. He's not going to come out, Trump, and say, okay, well, I'll start relaxing sanctions as a goodwill gesture, because he'll be seen to be weak. And he can't be seen to be weak, even if he thinks the war should be over. But the question is, why does Trump want the war to be over? What's his real motivation? Because it makes him look good politically. On the international stage, he looks like the guy who, well, I stopped the war. I was the one who managed to persuade Putin to end the war. And he thinks it makes him look tough on the world stage. I think that's more than anything probably his motivation. I mean, and there's no doubt, despite some noises about wanting to end the war, the US won't change its stance. I don't think Russia has any expectations for that to happen. And because, of course, people like the US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has already called for tougher sanctions targeting Russia and its oil industry. So the question is, if Bessent's coming out making those statements and he's contradicting the president, then the question is, why is he in office? I mean, is he come into office to contradict Trump? I don't think so. I mean, why would he? It wouldn't make any sense. So, tightening anti-Russian sanctions, they feel on the oil industry, we can then force Russia to the table for peace talk. Russia's going to then be in a position where they're weak economically and they can't sell oil in the world. Well, they'll just find another way around that problem, because that's what they do and have repeatedly done. Sanctions are meaningless. In fact, it is a position of weakness for the United States to think that that's a position of strength. They need to be an adult, come to the table and say, okay, let's have a negotiated settlement and accept the war will continue, and then the war will end the second an agreement is reached. The other thing I think increasingly the Ukrainians are beginning to realise is that there's not going to be any negotiated settlement with their involvement. I think they feel that's increasingly unlikely. It might be why there are suggestions now that Zelensky wants to talk to Putin directly. Frankly, I think that's the best option for him. Far better he talks to Putin directly than allows the United States to do so. But I mean, the US clearly wants to be in the driving seat. No doubt about it. And this idea, nothing's going to be discussed about Ukraine without Ukraine, is just words. It's not a reality. Decisions about Ukraine shouldn't be made without Ukraine, but they're going to talk without Ukraine being present, and they already do so unofficially anyway. And of course, there's already been discussions between Scholz and Putin back in November, and then Macron said he wanted to have a conversation with Putin also, which made the Ukrainians further realise that, well, how much say are we going to have in terms of a negotiated settlement and ending the war? But Putin's been very clear what the preconditions for the settlement of the conflict are. The withdrawal of all Ukrainian armed forces from Donbass, Zaporozhye and Kherson, guarantees, not sure how that works, that Ukraine will not join NATO, the withdrawal of all Western sanctions against Moscow, and the establishment of a neutral and non-aligned status of Ukraine. It's as simple as that. I'm not saying that doesn't stick in the throat of the West, of course it does, but if Trump is true to his word, Putin's true to his word, he'll have to stick to that. Otherwise, he's going to look very weak in the eyes of his own people, and I don't believe for 1 minute he's going to do that here, or he will do anything that actually compromises the national security of his own country. After all, you don't go to war for 3 years and then capitulate when you've won the war. The other thing that's interesting is Trump, of course, for all his bluster, came out and goes, I'll end the war in 24 hours. Well, he's now handed his special envoy to Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, the job of ending the Ukraine conflict, apparently not in 24 hours or 24 days, but 100 days. And they've started to realise that trying to strike a deal with Putin is going to be far more difficult than Trump stated on when he was campaigning to be president. Where basically he even said he'd end the conflict before he took office. There are rumours that Trump is determined to control peace talks himself, so what's the point in handing responsibility to Keith Kellogg? Therefore, I don't think Kellogg's can be described as being independent. Also, has he ever served as a diplomat? So is he going to really take part in any negotiations with Russia? At the end of the day, this is one of these situations where reality kicks in. And of course, Trump has made so many statements, and it's questionable whether he actually believes half of them himself. He's talked about stopping supplying weapons to Ukraine, and he wants to meet with Putin, but does he want to meet with Putin because it makes him look good on the world stage? Is he more interested in that than in actually having any meaningful conversation? Because the Russians can sit there and go, well, yes, we're open to dialogue over Ukraine, but the priority is to address the root causes of the war, the crisis. Russia was already assessing statements made by Trump and his team about their willingness to restore contact. Now, of course, I'm no diplomat, but Putin, contrary to what many people in the West believe, will be diplomatic along with Lavrov and the rest of the Kremlin who would enter into negotiations. They will listen. Doesn't mean they'll ever agree to anything. But at the end of the day, I think the situation here is that there is going to be very hard to find any agreement between Trump and Putin. They have very different perspectives on this, not least how the war should end, and not, from Russia's perspective, to end before a negotiated settlement that is reached, and how does that get enforced anyway? And therefore, it is in Zelensky's interest to talk to the Russians directly. And just start to find a way to say, okay, how are we going to end this war? And find a solution that ends up being better for Ukraine, because I don't believe in any way, shape or form anyone inside the West has got any interest in trying to end this war in any way other than to make themselves look politically better or to avoid massive political fallout, and made to be looked for the very foolish decisions they made in trying to prosecute this war, believing that Ukraine could win this war. And of course, because of investing so much political capital, they don't want the war to end now unless they can somehow persuade us all that Ukraine won the war. But we're already starting to hear very puzzling statements from Western leaders about how, well, Ukraine might not be able to win the war in totality. So what are they going to do? Say, well, this settlement means Ukraine partially won the war and Russia lost the war, when in fact, of course, it's absolutely not the case. But there is a desperation and in amongst the ranks of Western leaders and Western military personnel. There are rumours that all the military personnel or anyone associated in the United States with the war has been removed from office. I don't know whether that's the case or not, but there are suggestions that's the case. I think you'll see various other people within the NATO establishment eventually lose their jobs, because there was a clear abject failure for the Western military to understand who they were fighting a war with and what the context of that war is. But this is a very difficult time. It is in no way, shape or form a situation where Trump thinks he's going to roll in, look like I ended the war, and thinks he'll score enormous political points domestically and internationally. I think Russia's going to play hardball, and I think they could end up coming to serious conflict, not in a military sense, but in a sense that there's just no agreement to end the war. And if that is the case, then the war's going to just carry on. And if the war carries on, what does the United States do? Because Trump's already talked about refusing to finance the war anymore or support the war. So what's he going to do? Walk away from it and just say it's nothing to do with me, and leave the Europeans to fight the war, who are going to be totally incapable of doing so? So it is a very difficult time. Hopefully common sense and cool heads will prevail. I don't see this in any way, shape or form leading to any escalation of the war other than Russia continuing the war and taking more territory, regrettably killing huge amounts more of Ukrainians. And also in the process, of course, this is just demilitarizing NATO. And the longer the war goes on, the likelihood of NATO surviving in the future becomes less and less certain. And with that, I think we'll end this segment. Thank you for all your ongoing support. Please like, share, subscribe, and comment. Pass the word around. We like to grow the channel. We think we have some value in what we're doing. And with that, I'll say goodbye.